Yesterday, Jamie Driscoll, the mayor for North Tyne, left the Labour Party. That now means he's governing as an independent, and it also means he'll be standing as an independent when he seeks to contest the newly formed North East mayoralty next May. Speaking of which, Driscoll's crowdfunder launched yesterday afternoon. It's so far raised over £85,000. Not bad. Mayor Driscoll appeared on BBC Newsnight yesterday evening, making the argument for why a Labour government should oppose austerity. His opposite number on the show was former Labour staffer John McTernan, who said this.
Labour is going to inherit, when we win the election next year in 2025, the worst fiscal situation, the worst, most stretched public spending limits and tax receipts that any incoming Labour government has had since the war. And we've said really clearly, we will say what we will do and we'll say how we will fund it. And there's loads of people who would say we should remove this limit. After that, then the next question is, are you going to remove the total benefits cap? Then after that, are you going to do something about local housing allowance? After that, you can do something about universal credit itself, because universal credit is the consequence of Osborne taking £12 billion out of welfare over the period that he was Chancellor. There's a whole load of things. Labour has to have priorities. It was Nye Bevan who said the language of priorities is the religion of socialism.
So lifting kids out of poverty is not a priority for Labour?
Lifting kids out of poverty by growing the economy so we can spend more on public services is the priority. Okay. It has to be.
Jamie Driscoll, isn't this just fiscally sensible and also pretty popular with voters?
I don't think the idea of keeping people in poverty actually is fiscally sensible at all. We know that it's storing up problems for the long term. If you look at where we are in Britain now, and I think everybody who's not defending a political party would agree we're in a serious mess about a lot of things. This is the result of, 13 years of austerity, where we've had public services cut. It costs a fortune to keep kids in poverty. Our health is plummeting. Our NHS waiting lists are through the roof. Teachers are leaving education in droves. How are we going to get a healthy, productive, high-skilled workforce unless we look after kids?
What do you think this decision tells us about Sir Keir Starmer's approach to welfare?
I think if we look slightly beyond that, and the report that came out recently, he says, I'm not interested in hope and change. Or Wes Streeting saying, you know what, no hope is better than false hope. When you have the leadership of the Labour Party saying, we have no hope, then that goes beyond expectation management. That is, we don't have a plan. And I'm worried about that.
I thought that was seriously oppressive stuff there from Jamie Driscoll. And I can't help but feel that in a sane political culture, Jamie Driscoll would be a, quote, centrist dad, rather than regarded as too radical to run for a Labour Party on the apparently centre-left. It's common sense to say that getting kids out of poverty is clearly to the long-term benefit of not just those kids and their families, but public services and the economy too. Driscoll went on to explain how Starmer's position on the benefit cap isn't even fiscally responsible.
I'm a big fan of fiscal responsibility, and I've demonstrated it. And until today, I was a Labour mayor, but they didn't seem to champion the fact that I've smashed the job creation target. Every pound I invest returns more than £3 to Treasury in payroll taxes alone.
Right, but so you're a big fan of fiscal responsibility when it's in your part of the world, but not when it's Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, this, I would say, isn't fiscal responsibility.
What is it then? What do you call it?
I think this is playing to a certain section of the electorate that are, I don't know, Daily Mail readers, whatever they are.
People who would need to vote for Labour in order for Labour to gain a majority.
Well, I think if you actually explain the reality of it, and we've seen the economics reports on your own programme there, that, for example, investing in retrofitting homes, every pound spent saves the NHS 42p alone. So investment is the way that you get this economy going again. You can't do it by saying, we have no hope, we're not going to spend anything. The signal, particularly if we talk about that 28 billion for the climate emergency, then if you look at what's happened in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's levered in billions, if not trillions. You must send a signal to the market. I know I work with businesses every day. They need to see a long-term plan because they can't turn the taps on and off if they're hiring researchers and plant and machinery.
Next up, Driscoll spoke about trusts in politics.
I don't think you win trust by saying what you're going to do and then you turning on your policies. It comes down a lot of the time to trust in integrity and in characters. People across politics are really worried that they can't trust anybody. There's millions of people thinking, who speaks for me right now? And when the number one trending thing on Twitter tonight was Sir Kid Starver, then I think that's not going to do the Labour Party any favours at all.
Twitter's not the real world, is it?
Nevertheless, that speaks to what people worry about. You know, if you're saying that stopping kids being in poverty with all the attendant long-term costs is not a priority, then I think people of every party are going to think, well,
we're saying getting this government out is the priority, and we'll do anything we can to get this government out. And having been beaten 4 times in a row, we really have to go a long way to meet the public where they are, not...
What the party should have been doing is praising the work of Metro mayors who've demonstrated that they can do it. I've done this without raising a penny in council tax, by working with businesses to lever the money in.
It's crazy, isn't it? You know, Jamie Driscoll has actually been elected. He's a very popular candidate going forward. You know, that's why they blocked him, right? Because they knew he was going to win the candidacy internally within Labour. He's been praised by people across the political spectrum. But then, you know, John McTernan, who's never actually stood for public office, is telling him what you have to do to align yourself with the public. Michael, when it comes to actual delivery, Jamie Driscoll is a far more credible figure than anyone in the shadow cabinet. I think that's a pretty fair statement. What does it say about the Labour Party when somebody so, I think, credible and authoritative has been blocked from even standing for election?
I think his answers there were very, very impressive, very articulate guy. And I think this is one of the things which is so depressing about Keir Starmer's leadership, right? Because I think, as I've been saying, it's not completely nonsensical to think to become a Labour Prime Minister in our first past the post system with a right-wing media, you might have to sort of shave off lots of the left-wing arguments you might want to make. Now, I'm not necessarily, you know, it might be the case that Keir Starmer is just actually quite right-wing, or it might be that he is somewhat left-wing and he's decided that he wants to make all of these right-wing arguments to try and get elected in the style that New Labour did by reassuring the sort of right-wing establishment that has power in this country. There's a couple of problems with that, which is obviously, one, you're going to massively minimise what you are able to do in government because you'll have made all of these pledges which are sort of putting you in a straitjacket for when you enter government. And two, and I think this is very important, which is by making those arguments which are meant to reassure Britain's right-wing establishment, you are shifting the Overton window to the right. So when, say, you've got someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who's leader of the Labour Party, he is making these left-wing arguments. That means that around 40% of the time, you know, if you're the opposition, the government gets 60%, the opposition get 40%. 40% of the time, the politician on the television is telling you that austerity isn't necessary, that taxing the rich isn't necessarily going to crash the economy, that people on benefits don't deserve to be demonized, right? And that has an effect of, not necessarily, well, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn did shift the Overton window, but if you were, say, following Jeremy Corbyn, if this was a sort of continuous, consistent policy of the opposition, that would sort of anchor public opinion somewhere to the centre, right? Because you've got those voices being platformed. Now, if Keir Starmer has decided he doesn't want to be that voice, he doesn't want to be anchoring political discourse to the left because he thinks the only way to possibly get elected is to be quite right-wing, which essentially I think is the decision he's made, then that could be attenuated if you say, well, let's have people who are at a sort of safe distance from us who can make some of those left-wing arguments to stop public discourse just going wildly to the right without hearing anyone making the correct and true arguments, which is that taxing the rich isn't going to crash the economy. In fact, in many respects, it will improve the economy because these people are just inflating asset prices, which does nothing for anyone other than increase working people's rent, right? So that would be good for the economy. But you need those, you could call them outriders, to be there, making sure that argument for left-wing policies is being heard. So Keir Starmer can then go through the middle. You know, Keir Starmer doesn't want to be the person making the most left-wing arguments on the television. He could have outriders do that. But what the Labour Party seem to have done is to systematically say anyone to our left must be expunged from public life. And if you're saying we're not going to make left-wing arguments because we won't get elected, and two, anyone who makes left-wing arguments can't possibly be in the Labour Party, then what you are doing is essentially banning left-wing arguments from public discourse. And I can't see how that doesn't get us to a situation where discourse just moves ever further and further and further to the right. And in that way, it is more depressing than Tony Blair and New Labour, because Tony Blair didn't decide to expunge any left-wing arguments from public life, but it seems as if Keir Starmer wants to do that. People might say, he wasn't reselected as a mayor. This isn't expunging him from public life. Well, how our media operates is that they give a certain amount of time to the Conservatives, a certain amount of time to Labour, and then a little bit of time to the Lib Dems. If you aren't in one of those parties, it's very difficult to get a hearing from the mainstream press. So if you are kicking out anyone who might be able to talk with authority in a manner which makes the correct arguments about the economy. Maybe, I think there would be a legitimate critique, which would be to say Jamie Driscoll, maybe he would have trouble if he was leader of the Labour Party to get elected in certain parts of the Red Wall where people are very fiscally conservative. That's a reasonable argument. I'm not 100% sure if I think it's correct, but it's reasonable. But the idea that anyone making these correct arguments can't make them anymore, which is essentially what Keir Starmer is saying, is depressing and dangerous, I think.
You can look at, for instance, what Sadiq Khan's now doing around free school meals in London. That's, again, something which the Labour leadership isn't a fan of. And I think it's an asset for the party, surely, to have Burnham, who can appeal to the demographic that the party needs in Greater Manchester, Sadiq Khan in London, or Jamie Driscoll in the North East. You have a range of, you have what's called audience segmentation in sort of political public relations, and they do it pretty well. And I think what you're saying there, Michael, it should be sort of held against what's gone on in the United States, right? Joe Biden has not sought to expunge and expel anybody to his left in the Democratic Party. It's very useful for Joe Biden to say, look, actually in my own party, there are people to my left. There's the Squad, or there's Bernie Sanders. I'm not as left-wing as those guys. When you hear Fox News, they don't often attack Biden. It's for his sort of cognitive decline or whatever. It's very rarely for his policy agenda. They attack the Squad. It's not a bad thing for a Labour leader seeking to present themselves as in the centre to be criticised from their left. It's not a bad thing if that's your strategy. Another candidate blocked from standing by the Labour leadership is Mish Rahman. Mr. Rahman was endorsed by 7 trade unions. Here's his statement. I have been informed by the Labour Party I have not made the long list in the Wolverhampton West parliamentary selection, despite gaining strong local support and the backing of 7 trade union affiliates. This is not a shock. It is what I and my team expected. None of my fellow Bernie Grant Leadership Programme alumni have been selected. We were told the party would support us towards leadership positions as black and ethnic minority activists. Yet after this long listing process, nothing has changed. As a 2-term, currently elected member of Labour's NEC, that's its National Executive Committee, I've chaired panels for long listing in other parliamentary selections. I'm therefore allowed to long list candidates, but have not been long listed myself. I was blocked for how I voted on the NEC in relation to the composition of party disciplinary structures following the EHRC report. This was a position shared by an array of NEC members, including trade union representatives. Being blocked for casting a vote in a democratic process should be a serious concern for all of us in the Labour Party. I found the blocking of Mish Rahman so informative in regard to how the establishment thinks about diversity. You can be brown or black, LGBT or straight, a man, woman or non-binary. It doesn't matter, as long as you agree with us on everything. But as soon as there's the slightest disagreement, then I'm afraid you're the wrong kind of brown or black person. Forget even being elected, you won't even be on the long list. It's about embracing diversity regarding how we look, as long as there's complete homogeneity in what we think. In this world, people from minority backgrounds, however celebrated they are by establishment liberals, are little more than background decoration. And if they err, they can be easily disposed. And don't you dare think you can be more than that. Given the findings of the Ford report, which has basically been ignored by Starmer since it was published, it's worth asking precisely how much progress has been made on the politics of race in this country at all. The Labour right in particular don't seem to like Tories of colour. Just ask Rupert Huck, who said Kwasi Kwarteng can't really be black because he's a Tory. So brown and black people can't be conservatives, and they can't be democratic socialists. But they can be political heroes, inspirational, wonderful. Elevate them. Just so long as they're in the political centre and they agree with everything we say. That's called diversity. Maybe use that as a hashtag when you discuss it on Twitter.